Hello and welcome to a special edition of Spectator TV. I'm Katy Balls and I'm joined by Fraser Nelson and James Forsyth. Now, we've just had what neither the Prime Minister or Chancellor would call a budget, but a series of announcements that are having repercussions as the day has gone on. James, can you just fill us in on what Kwasi Kwarteng announced in the Commons chamber today and what the initial reaction from the markets is?
So Kwasi Kwarteng stood up at 9:30 this morning. And, we had been told that there would be more rabbits than would ship down, and it didn't disappoint. He has abolished the 45p rate of income tax. He has brought forward a 1p cut in the basic rate of income tax. He has cancelled the corporation tax rise. He has reversed the national insurance rise and abolished the health and social care levy going forward. He has, as you predicted he would on Coffee House yesterday, introduced VAT-free shopping for foreign tourists coming to the UK. He has changed the starting rate for stamp duty, raising it quite considerably for first-time buyers. There are a whole series of measures, the upshot of which the UK government will be borrowing more than £70 billion more than it said it expected to in April. Now, I think it is fair to say that the markets have not reacted entirely in the way the government would have hoped to this. The pound is, at the time we are recording this, down at below 110. And the cost of government borrowing is rising and has risen at a relatively rapid rate today. And so I think this is the essential gamble that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng are taking is twofold. It is that they can boost the rate of growth of the economy to this 2.5% that they talk about, which means that the kind of public finances all begin to add up. And they can then win a political argument about the fact that, in the first fiscal event of this government, they have decided to abolish the top rate, the 45p rate of income tax, uncap bankers' bonuses, do lots of things that, politically cautious Conservative leaders have thought would have thought was too risky. And so I think everything now depends on whether this budget, let's call it
what it is.
This budget, whether this budget delivers growth or not. I think the one thing I think we can all agree on, whatever you think of the overall package, is that when the exit poll drops in 2024, we will look back on this budget as being the reason for whatever result we end up seeing.
Now, Fraser, James mentioned some of the market reaction. I think what's interesting here is you could have ministers say, it doesn't matter, we don't want to be judged by this today. But yet, there was a tweet from Chris Philp, who's the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, quite early on, and it was a quote tweet of a journalist who had pointed out that actually straight after Kwasi Kwarteng's plan for growth, actually the pound was doing fairly well, and he suggested this showed that there was faith in the government's plan. But then something happened after.
Yes, the pound then tanked.
And
it wasn't the only thing that started to tank. The FTSE 100 tanked as well. And you'd think that's strange in a pro-enterprise budget. Why were the shares tanking so much? And that's because they now think that interest rates are going to have to go that much higher now, perhaps up to 5%. And people previously, they thought about 4.2, 4.5%. So we're seeing all of these ramifications. Now, I think what the government did wrong was, because it suspended the Office for Budget Responsibility, there wasn't really any plan as to how this money really is going to be paid for. You can borrow shed loads of money if you come up with a slightly more coherent plan as to how you're going to pay it back in the end. But they decided to dispense with all of that. And I think that discombobulated the markets a bit. So not only have we had the pound tanking, but we've had the gilt yields, how much the government's going to have to spend on its borrowing, heading up to about 4%. Now, just a couple of years ago, the markets were thinking they would never get above 0.5%, let alone a 4%. Now, that's going to cost billions of pounds more for the government. So the market reaction is not at all what they would have wanted. Now, it's quite possible that the markets have got it wrong. They get quite a lot wrong. It's quite possible the economists discount the pro-growth effects of all of the reforms announced today. The economists, after all, completely underestimated David Cameron when he wanted to cut employers' tax, and as a result, you had employment growing all the way through the Cameron years, every single year, astonished the markets. So that's not to say that this budget is a failure. It's just to say that right now you'd be hard-pushed to find that many people who are confident about its success. Now, this is a gamble. Well, I must admit, I started today thinking that they probably weren't going to deliver on the the sheer verbal promises they've made here. We promised a game-changing budget. Now I thought you're going to need a lot of tax cuts to make that. But right enough, we have had the biggest tax-cutting budget in 50 years. That's if you include the tax rises that have been abolished as well as the taxes that are actually being cut. To actually cut taxes for the highest earners is politically incredibly audacious. So the biggest winners right now, of course, are the highest paid. So you've got people who were paying, I think the top rate of tax effectively was just over 48%. Now it's going to go down to 42%. That's a pretty big tax cut. But then again, for your average person, you're not just getting 1% off income tax, the basic rate. You're getting 2.5% off national insurance. That was split between employer and employee. So that's a pretty sizable tax cut as well. So this is certainly a government serious about cutting taxes. Whatever else you say about Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss, you can't say they were not serious about delivering the tax cuts. And there's other areas as well that we haven't even spoken of, which in and of themselves will be a very big deal. The IR35, for example, is an accounting procedure for how freelancers are taxed. That should really help get people back into self-employment. And there is talk of getting, I think it's 120,000 more people back into work by tightening the welfare conditions. Now, given that there's something like 5.3 million people on out-of-work benefits, getting another 0.1 back is not that big a deal. But all of this is in the right direction if you're a supply-side reformer. What makes people like me slightly nervous is that we wonder how well it's been thought through. I've spoken to, it's funny that I am a classic liberal. I always have been. I've always thought that countries are fairer and stronger and more cohesive when the government gives more power back to people, lets them keep more of their money. So people like me should be delighted today. But instead I'm feeling a little bit nervous because I'm not quite sure if enough has been done to prepare the ground for it, to explain to the markets what's happening, because ultimately the markets will decide, are they going to lend all of this money to the British government? There's a massive amount, James was saying, £70 billion more they want to borrow. Now, are the markets going to do that, and on what terms? I spoke to somebody earlier on today who's feeling very pessimistic about it, who is saying that he isn't going to really believe if he gets his tax cut in April, because this government might not even last until then. The markets might just decide, no, we've had enough of this, there might be a spiral, and it all might go downhill. So this is a gamble, I think, and one that will take quite a few days to settle. And perhaps the biggest test will be to see if anybody is seriously upgrading their growth forecasts as a result.
James, clearly, I think, as Fraser points out, the markets are still trying to work out what exactly has gone on, and there is a serious question as to has enough been done to prepare. But Liz Truss is in a race against time, something both you and I have written about, and the sense I got from those around her was that ultimately they thought we have to do everything in this event because A, you need all the time you can for the next election to try and boost growth, but two, her political capital, her political stock's probably never been higher, probably higher this morning than this afternoon. So therefore, when the longer you go on, the more other problems dominate, events outside of your control, and also party management gets harder. So that might explain how we got to here. But do you think Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng will still be feeling as confident at the time we're recording around 4 p.m. as they were this morning at 9 a.m?
Not to put too much weight on the Chris Philp tweet, but I think it is interesting because it does suggest that they didn't expect the kind of reaction you're seeing today. Because otherwise, you would think cautiously, well, I'm not gonna highlight that as the metric on which we want to be judged by, in case it goes the wrong way. I think the question for them, as you say, they are a Prime Minister and a Chancellor in a hurry. They know that they've got 18 months to get growth going, so they piled all these measures in. I think one thing that I think, with the benefit of hindsight, would have actually benefited them would have actually been to have an OBR forecast today, because I think the lack of the forecast, it almost made it a little bit look like they were piling all this stuff in here because they didn't want the external examiner to report on what it would mean. And so you therefore, as aware of these things, the most negative predictions about what it's going to mean are filling the vacuum, although it's worth noting that more than 70 billion figure is from the Treasury's own numbers. I think the biggest problem they have with the markets is the UK economy has grown very slowly since the 2008 financial crash. And so although 2.5% trend growth does not sound that ambitious, it is essentially doubling what has been the trend growth rate of the economy since then. And I think people are like, well, how are you going to do that? How politically sustainable are the measures that you're going to take to do that? And I think they are trying some things. For example, it's quite clear what they're trying to do with these investment zones, kind of, planning reform, kind of, place by place. The problem is it doesn't quite have the same big bang effect it does if you manage to liberalise the system nationwide or England-wide because it's devolved. And so I think those are the challenges. I think the other big political challenge for them is they are betting that growth can smash through these arguments about distribution. But I think one of the challenges is that the headline measure today is this abolition of the 45p rate. And that is what they're going to have a big argument about now. The reason that George Osborne didn't abolish it, just took it down to 45p, the reason it hasn't ever gone has been that no one was quite prepared to expend the political capital of having this fight. And I think that that is now going to dominate politics. And I mean, you've got Labour conference next week; they will go for it. I think there's an interesting question about how Labour attack it. Do they just attack it as a tax cut for the rich, or do they say it's wrong that someone on £51,000 a year is paying the same amount of tax as someone on the same marginal tax rate as someone on £150,000? So I think there are some dilemmas for Labour here. But
also, do they not just say that the Tories are failing by their own standards? Because Kwasi Kwarteng has given them a big stick to beat him with. He said that he wants to get growth of 2.5%. So sure, you can attack Tories for cutting taxes, you can attack if you're Labour, but fundamentally, surely what you want to say to the swing voters is that even by their own standard, the Tories are failing. They promised you 2.5% growth and they haven't delivered it.
And I mean, the other stick that Labour will use, which they've been handed by this, is when a Conservative Chancellor talks about a cycle of stagnation when the Tories have been in power for 12 years, you do have an argument going that, look, come on, why should you carry on voting for these people when they themselves are saying that the economic results of the last 12 years have been disappointing?
Now, when it comes to the MP reaction, you've had former Cabinet Minister Julian Smith coming out and actually saying that the 45p cut is wrong at a time of cost of living and it's the wrong decision. Fraser, do you think there are going to be nerves among Tory MPs, perhaps even some ministers, as they look at where the pound is going and perhaps also worry about the political ramifications?
Well, not so much for the pound, because of course, if you're an exporter, this is good for you. I mean, falling currency is a double-edged sword, as is a rising currency. So that is less politically tricky than trying to sell tax cuts for the rich. That's one of the hardest things to sell if you're a Tory MP. If you're up there, doing canvassing, you'll be facing somebody who's really having difficulty, even with the fuel price cap, to balance the budget. And they will know that the people being given the biggest break in this country are those over 150 grand. It opens them up to the accusation of the party of the rich. And this is what stopped them abolishing the upper rate. I mean, David Cameron wanted to do it, George Osborne did, Rishi Sunak did, but none of them dared to do it because they thought that politically it would be so damaging that it would take away whatever gain they may get by bringing the rate of tax down to the standard 40p. Oh, by the way, should I say in Scotland, if Nicola Sturgeon doesn't do this, which she might not, then you'd end up with a very big difference in the top rate of tax in Scotland and in England. So that will be another side effect of this. That politically, a lot now depends on these seeds that they've planted actually bearing fruit. There isn't much time. There is, I reckon, about 18 months she's got, really, to prove that she's brought more to Britain than simply record amounts of national debt and record amounts of, sure, like the stamp duty will help, but it's also going to be very expensive to get a mortgage. I mean, you're not going to be getting any of these 2% rates anytime soon. I mean, you recently renewed your mortgage, Katy. What rate did you get? Pretty good.
I don't want to upset those watching at home.
My point is...
It was pretty good. But if we are going to go there, Fraser, at the time, you told me not to get a fixed rate mortgage and you told me I'd made a mistake and you said I should go for a variable.
And I am now feasting on humble pie, Katy, because you foresaw what I did not, that the markets were going to go way higher than expectation, and what looked to me like a toppy fixed rate that you got now looks like the sale of the century. So you are quids in, while the variable rate is going to, the base rate is going to be 4.5, perhaps 5%.
Shouldn't we have one of these disclaimers? This is not financial advice that you have to have.
I'm not a super
I would advise anybody to not to follow my own personal financial advice.
I think there are two interesting questions which follow from this. The kind of classic fiscal conservative response would be, well, look, if you're going to do this, you've got to have spending cuts. if you're going to cut tax by this much, the state has got to stop doing some things.
And if they had done that today, that would have sent a signal to the market.
Of course, yeah. I mean, I think if they'd announced some spending cuts at the same time, the markets would not be reacting the way they would. But the problem you've got now, politically, is the politics pulls in the opposite way of the economics. Because we're going to have public arguments about public sector pay in the coming months. And it's going to be quite hard to explain why nurses and teachers should have a below inflation, a real terms pay cut, a below inflation pay rise, when the government has just shown, as the government has said such confidence, that it can just borrow more money to fund the things that it wants. And so I think that's a tension there. I think there is also, as Fraser said, this tension with the bank, right? Which is, it's not just that the bank, I think, is going to raise interest rates. It's that the bank is continuing with quantitative tightening. So that means there is even more UK government debt in the market for people to absorb. And I think this is quite interesting because Jerry Lyons, who is one of the architects of Trussonomics, he wrote a piece earlier this week urging the bank not to do QT at the moment, saying, this is not the right moment for quantitative tightening. They voted this week unanimously to go ahead with it. And so I think that tension between the bank and the government is one of the other things to watch in the coming months.
Well, one of the things I'm fascinated by is what happens if it all goes wrong. Like, say the markets do go out of control, we do a strike, and Liz Truss has to choose. Does she then cut spending, or does she abandon some of her tax rises? What do you think, James?
I think she is not going to increase taxes. I think this is absolutely Katy's written about this. It's absolutely core to her being. And I think what you've seen here is, Liz Truss has, in basically, because of the Tories' kind of big spending turn, everyone had to make a choice between, which do they value more? Sound public finances, balanced budgets and all that, or tax cuts. As Kate Andrews writes at Coffee House, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng have firmly plumped for tax cuts. That is what matters. I don't think she is going to back away from those tax cuts, come what may. I think if she was in a position, I think let's not get ahead of ourselves. I think we're getting mad, But if she had to do something different, I think it would be much more likely to be spending cuts.
And in the past, I remember when I spoke to her in France when she was Foreign Secretary a week before Boris Johnson ultimately was pushed out, and she did talk about how money could be saved in other departments. So you get the sense that is politically difficult with the current coalition, but that is where she would go if she was up against the wall.
I wonder if that's the card she hasn't played yet, though. Because today wasn't the budget, but perhaps they do intend later on to come up with spending cuts. Mind you, they've said how much extra they're borrowing. I have found that
the political choreography, if they are planning to come up with spending cuts, the political choreography was odd to not put it all out there at the same time.
No, especially not if you want to assuage the markets. But I guess this will be the big question, though. Will they wear it? I think not just for the next few weeks, but the next few days. We'll be very anxious ones in the Treasury just to see how all this will go down. Yeah,
and just finally on that, James, we talked about 18 months in terms of how long she has probably to the next election. But how much time does she have really in terms of... Right now everyone's looking at the markets and people saying, this is landing badly. How much time has she got to really show this is working? Has she got months, or are people going to panic a bit?
Well, we have a floating currency, and so therefore she has more time. I think so. I think people trying to draw comparisons to events of 30 years ago are way off base, because there isn't some dramatic moment at which people will say, that this has worked or this hasn't worked. I think the danger for her is actually is what you started this podcast on. It's about political capital. If you have kind of continuing, bad news from the markets, she will have less of a hold over her party. You'll hear more dissenting voices. It'll be more difficult for her to get her way. And I think also things like, the public sector unions will be more prepared to push hard for big pay rises because they will think that she's in a more politically vulnerable situation. I think the challenge here is, she, I think, has a mandate for what she is doing from the Tory membership. But I think there are Tory MPs who are nervous about this, and I think that in terms of Julian Smith, I think was the kind of has kind of gone public with that, which is no small thing for a former chief whip. But I think the question is there a sense that this is beginning to deliver in terms of getting growth going? Because that is everything turns on whether it can do that or not, because they haven't built the expectations up as if we can do this, we can avoid a deep recession, we can kind of get the country through this without too much damage. They have said that they can get to 2.5.
I wonder what the tomorrow's papers are going to look like. I mean, normally after such a big tax cut giveaway, you'd expect very favourable headlines. The Chancellor's done this, biggest tax cut in a generation, etc. And of course, that normally happens after a period of growth, where there are dividends and you can celebrate the growth by giving a tax cut. That is typically how governments tend to work. This time it's the opposite. Everything is going terribly badly. So you think you'll have a massive tax cut as a kind of Hail Mary pass. We better hope this will work because nothing else will. So there is a feeling of nervousness now rather than celebration, even though we are talking about the biggest tax cutting budget for 50 years and something that will make almost everybody in this country better off as a result of today's announcements anyway. If you look at it in the round, of course, we're just looking really at the tax burden going back to where it was about 5 or 6 years ago. So this isn't going back decades. But it's funny that to think with so much spending has been done today, so much tax has been cut. And I don't think that Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng are going to be taking bows in front of much of the media tomorrow, but we'll see.
The jury is out. Thank you, Fraser. Thank you, James. And thank you for watching.